Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to CSIS. My name is Andy Kutchins. I'm director of the Russia and Eurasia program, and we are really delighted to be hosting an old friend, Vladimir Milov, and someone who I think is one of the brightest young or youngish figures on the Russian political scene. As part of our series here for the Russia balance sheet on emerging Russian futures, transformation, evolution, or stasis. And something makes me think that Vladimir is going to suggest something in between evolution and transformation. He is, of course, the leader of the Democratic Choice Movement, a former Deputy Minister of Energy, a position he served up until 2002. At which point he founded his own think tank, the Institute for Energy Policy, and has long been one of the most highly regarded energy analysts and political analysts in Russia. And a few years ago, he made a move himself, a transition to public politics. And he has been in the opposition for the last several years. And we look very much forward to hearing his perspective on a changing Russia, the politics of economic and energy development, all topics that are interrelated and ones which Vladimir has intimate expertise. So, Vladimir, the floor is yours, and welcome here to Washington.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and many thanks, Andy. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. There is so much to tell about recent developments in Russia and potential future events. All of a sudden, the situation in my country had started to become extremely dynamic, which is a clear departure from more or less stagnating and status quo mode which we experienced in the previous years, where everybody had predictions that for many, many years to come things will remain in a business as usual scenario. It's quite clear that it's not going to be the case, particularly after the recent months. I'm actually tempted to speak about a lot of important and different things, but I will try to focus primarily, I think, what is a bit of forgotten story of the recent period on the economic situation, which is indeed having a very strong impact on the current political developments in the country, and would influence future strategic changes which are inevitably to occur in Russia. You know, of course, about very dynamical political situation, unexpected results of different types of elections which have shown that popularity of the authorities is not as strong as many observers had perceived before. You saw for the first time in probably 20 years a real mass protest demonstrations out on the streets of Russian capitals. And there's been a lot of commentators trying to explain all that with the growing demand for respect and dignity from Russia's growing middle class and other notions like that. I have to say that although everything of that kind is very important, there's clearly a strong economic component to the recent Russian political dynamics. When I was speaking in November last year, when I was saying that, speaking at the Chatham House in London, somebody called me neo-Marxist for saying these things. Well, I would argue that I'm not neo-Marxist, but clearly there is a very strong economic component to what's happening in modern Russia. Particularly that contrast with the golden era of Putin, his 80 years of his first two presidential terms, is so striking if you remember the situation of 4 years ago when Putin was nominally leaving the post and transferring the formal powers to Dmitry Medvedev. Basically, when he was delivering his goodbye speeches as formally outgoing president, he presented strong economic performance as his main achievement. And at that time, in early 2008, I've just entered officially the opposition politics, publishing together with Boris Nemtsov the report Putin the Results, the first version of it, which had delivered a strong critical assessments of the results of Putin's performance. We have been talking with a lot of people discussing Putin's legacy and potential scenarios for future political development. And even many of those who actually were viewing Putin and his performance negatively were still saying to us, like, look, guys, you can't beat his supremacy because there's such a strong economic performance that overshadows all the rest. And there was very much truth to these words because despite the fact that 8 years of Putin's first two presidential terms have delivered strong macroeconomic performance of Russia, there were a lot of irregularities like growing social inequality. Social inequality turned out to be much higher compared to the 1990s. And there were other problems like increasing dependence of the economy and on raw materials exports, also much higher than in the 1990s. But still, mostly everyone in the Russian society had benefited from economic growth one way or another. What have happened in the recent 4 years is that situation had dramatically structurally changed. Because nominally the economy had returned on the recovery track. We've seen 4% GDP growth, we've seen low inflation, and this is why actually I have a lot of lack of understanding when I talk about this impact of economic developments on the political situation with Russian macroeconomists, because they tend to look at macro indicators and basically do not notice a lot of things which happens behind that. But there are clearly worrying signs which can tell you that a lot of things are truly going wrong in the economy. I think first, the clearest issue is that recent 4 years have been marked with dramatic decline of growth in real disposable income. During 2000 to 2008, the average rates of growth of real disposable income were over 12% a year. Over 12%. It's an overwhelming performance. Of course, everybody would vote for a politician who is in charge with figures like that. But what we have seen is, despite nominal recovery, despite these nominal figures of GDP growth at around 4%, we've seen in 2009, 2010, the growth in real disposable income shrinking down to 2–3% a year. And the recent year, extremely important, had delivered the lowest figures since 1990s. For 10 months of 2011, the real disposable income growth was negative. For those of you who do not know these things, that might seem striking, because how can you allow that in a pre-election year if you are the head of the very centralized government, which can do anything in this country? But that was the case. Only November and December had brought change, which have resulted in real disposable income growing at 0.8% a year compared to 2010. But still, this is obviously a lowest indicator since 1990s, and made a lot of people unhappy, because what was remarkable, particularly about last year's growth, is that although salaries in the private sector did pick up and were growing significantly, it was real pensions and real wages in the budget system which were negative and which dragged this whole situation down. So what happened in the recent 4 years is that a lot of different groups were negatively affected, not only by the outbreak of the economic crisis in 2008–2009, but also, I have to say, by the change in perception of the future, because previously we had used, like, you know, many people in the West during the credit boom before the outbreak of financial crisis, we have used to these charts showing that everything will continue to grow 45 degrees upwards without any kind of end in sight. And that was the situation in Russia, for instance, at the moment, just before the crisis when Putin had transferred nominal powers to Medvedev. That was exactly the case. Nobody did expect major interruptions to that continuing sustainable growth. Now, the recent 3-4 years had delivered a dramatic change in attitude. What we have is a more or less sustained stagnation environment with no clear understanding of how the economy would get back on the track of sustainable growth. And even with officially appearing negative forecasts, just when I was leaving the country to come here to speak at CSIS, for the first time in a long period, the government had officially announced that it might reconsider GDP growth forecast downwards to 2% a year. Today, earlier in the morning, when I woke up, I opened the internet and I found that central bank had announced that capital flight during the first quarter of this year was recorded again at a record high number of 35. Net capital flight during first quarter over $35 billion. You know, dramatic capital flight figures which have been experienced by Russia last year. It was something totally unlike other emerging markets, be it BRIC countries or Turkey. It's quite clear that political risks and bad investment climate, which was the issue before but was ignored by the government, has started to bite. And it's quite clear that it's continuing to do so despite the fact that official government economists had predicted that capital flight would cease to bother us this year and would be changed with net capital inflow. We can see clearly that this is not the case. Many social groups are affected by that, particularly a lot of those people who went demonstrating onto Bolotnaya and Sakharova rallies, because one of the segments which suffered dramatically from the recent stagnation environment was medium and small-sized businesses, particularly labor-intensive, who basically suffered not only from general weakness of the markets, but also from a dramatic increase in taxation. We have had a very significant, the most significant increase in non-mineral taxes, the social tax, in 20 years. The biggest increase of taxes in non-mineral sector since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 2011, social tax had increased from 26 to 34%. That is imposed on salaries officially paid to employees. And that was a dramatic hit, not on raw material producers because they are not very labor intensive, but that was a direct hit on medium and small sized businesses, which also suffered from that big time. So it was quite clear that even before this large scale nationwide protest voting and mass opposition street rallies, you could have seen, starting from 2009, 2010, you could have seen sizable protest demonstrations in the regions from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok, most of which were driven by discontent with economic policies of the government. I continue to argue that the recent political developments on the federal level are a continuation of that process, which had finally reached the capitals. And this process just did not start in Moscow. It was brewing and developing for several years throughout the country. And there was a clear illustration because, you know, every half a year we have a series of regional and local elections in different territories in October and March normally. And there was a clear indication that there is a great demand for protest voting, and official results of the ruling party in the regions were going down quite significantly and sustainably. That was a clear connection with the economic performance. Now, it raises a big question and dilemma for the authorities, what next? It's quite clear that capital inflow was the major driver of growth of our economy before the beginning of the crisis, not even the oil price, but the capital inflow. In 2005 to 2008, We had dramatic figures of capital coming into Russia. Cheap credit was widely available as a result of that, and everything was thriving. This is not the case anymore because capital is not coming back. In fact, it's fleeing. You can see a lot of comments from economists on recently announced capital flight figures. What they say is that Russian money had started to leave the country. It is the foreign investment which is coming in form of buying Russian bonds and so, but Russian capitals are leaving because people are losing confidence. That is also extremely strongly related to political developments because Vladimir Putin is not perceived by anyone in Russia, including his supporters, as a person who is able to perform dramatic shifts in his mentality, vision, and approach to economic policy. Instead, he is seen as the man who is well known for continuing the old track despite all the challenges which are becoming clearer and clearer. But there's this dilemma. If the government does not do anything to improve investment climate, then the capital would continue to flee and there will be no solid foundation for returning to sustainable growth. But to do that, to improve this investment climate, a lot of reconsiderations to the very model of countries' development built over the recent years is required. This model is over-centralized with excessive size of the government and role of the government and government's habit to interfere in private economic affairs, with very little role devoted for private initiative and private investment, with very strong and endemic corruption. Let me not elaborate on that. I'm sure all of you are aware of this problem. Bad regulatory environment, low predictability of government's regulatory actions. These are the things which are contributing to negative attitude and assessments of investors about Russia's economic future. You could have easily denounced all that claims by the opposition before when these things were present, but investors, as always, were hoping for the better and capital was coming into Russia. You cannot deny that now, because these are official figures of the Russian Central Bank and the Statistics Committee, which basically are the proof of what I'm saying at the moment. And what is indeed important is that the environment established recently is extremely damaging for, I have already said that, for the medium and small size and particularly innovation-focused businesses, because they are extremely labor-intensive. They are most vulnerable and exposed to the voluntary actions by the government and bad regulatory environment. They are the most suffering from the recent increases of taxation, and the government is discussing more increases in taxes because that's the price we have to pay for enormous growth of the size of the government. So there is a big challenge and dilemma lying ahead of the authorities, and the political situation would very much depend on how they would behave. Would they opt for a serious reform and basically reconsideration of everything they have done in the past years, reconsideration of the very model of countries' development which they have built? If they don't do that, negative process will only continue to emerge and progress, which will indeed have a direct impact on the political situation in a manner which I have just described. By the way, as far as politics is concerned, I strongly advise you to read the analysis done by Levada Center, the famous Russian opinion polling center, which had been analyzing the profile of people attending protest rallies, for instance, recent mass rally in February on Bolotnaya Square. There is a general perception that people who went there is a wealthy middle class who is demanding, demanding their voice to be heard. If you analyze specifically Levada figures of who was there, that's an absolutely contrary to that middle class notion. There is an absolutely wide range of various social groups represented there. In fact, Levada have shown that there were more pensioners than students on Bolotnaya Square. There were members of middle class, lower class, upper class, very rich people, very poor, students, pensioners, workers, managers, owners of their own businesses, everybody. That basically is a reflection that when describing the nature of the current protest political mood in the Russian society, we need not to follow the fashionable cliches put forward by certain analysts who are always selling their stories, but the objective analysis suggests that there is a big number of multiple and sometimes very different social groups affected by the negative economic situation. And I also wanted to say a few words about energy and its impact on what's happening. If you also take a look at different opinion polls done not only by Levada but even by pro-Kremlin opinion polling centers, what you could see, for instance, is they have a regular polling asking people about the issues which are of biggest concern for the average Russian citizens. And throughout these years, on top of that list was always severe growth in domestic prices, particularly prices for communal services. That was a clear result of government's policy to significantly increase domestic energy prices, particularly prices for gas. At some point, these policies seemed reasonable because prices were relatively low 10 years ago and did not reflect cost recovery and were not stimulating investment and not stimulating energy efficiency. But because the government have chosen to retain central, very Sovietic, very centralized monopolies in the energy area, particularly I'm talking about Gazprom, this process of price increase have seemingly got out of control. To the extent when, on the 23rd of March, just a couple of weeks ago, Vladimir Putin, speaking at the meeting, government meeting in the city of Kirishi dedicated to energy affairs, had openly argued against and prohibited to implement Gazprom's suggestion to perform another increase of domestic gas prices in Russia in the fourth quarter of this year by 26%. That is the first time on my memory, and believe me, I know the subject well enough, that is the first time ever on my memory when Mr. Putin have gone against his beloved child, Gazprom. Nominally, he was signing every wish list which Gazprom has been sending to government into his personal order. For the first time, he has publicly confronted Gazprom, which is an indication that the situation and the impact of monopoly environment in the energy sector is starting to get out of control. It's also starting to become very difficult because we have many other failures in energy policy which will have a strong impact on the country's ability to recover its economy. Remember, 10 years ago, growth in energy prices and physical volumes of energy exports had significantly contributed to the country's economic recovery after the '98 default. But right now, we don't have that opportunity because we are losing markets in Europe big time because of non-competitiveness of Gazprom. Just take a look at the official customs figures. Federal Customs Service said that during 12 months of 2011, only 117 BCM of gas was exported to the so-called far abroad, дальнее зарубежье, outside the CIS and Baltic states borders. That is compared to the 2008 pre-crisis level, which was above 154. That is more than a quarter less. And it looks like because of its incompetitiveness and inability to compete with the prices of gas at the spot market, my opinion, it's a bit tough, but I continue to stick to it. Gazprom will never be able to recover the volumes of physical supply of gas to the pre-crisis levels. Never. Not to mention the forecasts which existed before that Gazprom would break through a ceiling of 200 BCM of supplies of gas to Europe. Forget about it. Even the past year's figure was a bit optimistic for Gazprom, because it had an opportunity to fill the niche which have opened because of shutdown of Libyan supplies. That was temporary, and there won't be an opportunity anymore. this year, after first quarter, the gas exports to Europe is dramatically declining even compared to the numbers of last year. We also have the challenge of developing the new greenfield potential of our new oil and gas fields, particularly on the offshore, where we don't have any experience. Russian oil and gas engineering school have been developing for decades, mostly connected with the onshore production, while international engineers have been developing their offshore production skills in the Gulf of Mexico, North Sea, Persian Gulf, and so on. We don't have enough skills and enough experience to working in the offshore areas in the Arctic and so on to be able to maintain our oil and gas producing potential and to prevent big decline. We will need international involvement, international experience, and so on. You know what an environment there is now in Russia for direct strategic international investment in the oil and gas industry. We have been adopting the legislation limiting participation of strategic international investors. We have been squeezing out companies which have been successfully developing oil and gas projects, particularly I'm talking about Shell at Sakhalin-2. I don't think that story will be easily forgotten by the international investment community. We have seen major collapses of the announced deals between Russian and international energy companies like Rosneft and BP. So I don't think that developing the greenfield Russia's potential in oil and gas, given all these circumstances, will be an easy story. That is a major contribution to the overall picture of connection between economics and politics, which I just described. Kind of reminds me of the situation in late 1980s with the Soviet Union, when enormous size of the Soviet government, which was not corresponding to the new economic reality, basically forced Communist Party to try to squeeze more money out of the state oil-producing enterprises instead of reinvesting this money into further increase of production. That actually had triggered the beginning of a big decline in oil output, for instance, starting from the second half of 1980s, which had indeed contributed to enormous economic difficulties which we experienced in the 90s. The big decline of 92-94 was a direct result of that, because oil production was falling big time, and that was a direct result of actions of the Communist Party related to the oil and gas industry in the 1980s. So in this regard, in a lot of ways, Russian history repeats itself. And I think it is time for the current Russian rulers to think about these dilemmas and challenges if they want to sustain not only their political positions, but social, economic, and political situation in the country. Whether they will do it or not, that's an open question. I will be ready and happy to take your questions on that. And I think we won't be able to see before end of spring, beginning of summer, what the agenda of the new government will be. Let's see if they are learning from some of the lessons of the recent developments and are ready and willing to somewhat change their attitude and the model of country's development chosen before. I'll finish with that, and we'll be happy to take questions and participate in discussion. Thank you.
Vladimir, thank you very much. That was an excellent and comprehensive, insightful overview of the economic underpinnings of the political situation today. If I could, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about, before turning to the audience, about how you view the strategy for your organization, Democratic Russia, and what do you think is, how will the opposition now move from this phase of street protests and demonstrations to more sustained and organized political action?
Andy, we have multiple visions inside the Russian opposition about how the strategy, what strategy should be perceived and how we should behave in this changing environment. I'd say it's good, because to me competition is always better, because we will be able to see which strategy works and which not. I have to say that one big lesson that the opposition should learn from the recent events and the actual defeat at the presidential elections at the 4th of March, it was not as much Putin's victory because it was largely rigged voting, but it was as much an opposition defeat because we were not able to present a viable candidate like Ukrainians did in 2004 or Yugoslavians in 2000. That was one missing link. We were calling people on the streets just to demand fair elections, but a lot of people who went basically recognized that elections as they are would probably produce Putin as a winner, even if taken honestly, even if there will be a runoff, which had actually increased the certainty of Putin winning. That was not a matter of Putin still being the best politician in the country. It was a matter of absence of viable candidacy on the opposition's part, and that was a big problem. And another problem, which directly relates to what strategy we take on from now, was the huge disconnection. Let me be absolutely frank with you in this regard. Huge disconnection between the professional opposition as such, the leaders, the relatively narrow number of political activists, and the rest of the people with protest mindset who have just started to show their interest in politics and engage in these processes. Go and vote against the ruling party, monitor and observe the elections at polling stations and to ensure the fairness of the process, go to street rallies. We have a flood of newcomers into the Russian political process, and there's obviously a huge disconnection between their vision of what needs to be done and the general demand from population and voters and what the old professional leaders of the opposition have to offer. And it's quite clear that, for instance, I'm referring, it's not at all defeats, we also have success stories. I'm referring to the case of the elections of mayor of Yaroslavl last Sunday, where opposition candidate won with a landslide. That was a great example of strategy which we suggest, and it proved to be working. Because, for instance, we have had multiple examples and proofs that politics in Russia is extremely local. You cannot win many votes if you pursue just generic agendas speaking about values of democracy, human rights, and so on. You have to address local issues important to voters, roads, environment, housing, and all that stuff. Basically, and it's not at all bad because people who live in Russia, they very much seek good governance as the TOR, as what they want from people they elect to public posts. One big suspicion about the opposition politicians throughout the years was that people were viewing opposition as potentially non-professional, not able to govern effectively. So we have to prove on a mass scale to a large mass of Russian voters that yes, we can govern effectively, be accountable, and not undermine political competition and not try to prevent our adversaries from competing with us. I think we will have a chance to deliver that model of governance should we actively take part in the regional and municipal elections in the upcoming political cycle, should we compete for regional and municipal public posts, and prove that, one, yes, we can win public support big time and govern effectively, and two, we are ready, willing, and able to reach out to the voters outside the garden ring in Moscow. It was a clear problem of the protests of last winter that the turbulence was happening largely in capitals. And Putin's idea of his electoral campaign was that, okay, I got you fur coat wearers, you're not so satisfied with me anymore, so be it, but Nizhny Tagil is still with me. That was his message. And it was not that Nizhny Tagil is still with him, but it was that the opposition was missing in the regions. That's the problem. So we are aiming, and Yaroslavl have proved that we can be very effective in that. We are aiming at building up the muscle towards the next federal elections while reaching out to regions and actively working there. We have a capability to do that. And I think for the opposition it is important to remember that to be able to win and change the country for the better, we need to do a lot of dirty work. We need to do a lot of groundwork, and we need not to hesitate to go out there in the regions and compete. Compete for the support of voters, showing them that we are able to deliver and professionally address issues of local importance. I think we will be able to do that, and this is why I'm kind of optimistic looking in the future, because the authorities have proved that they are not particularly effective in addressing all these things.
And just to clarify, when you say dirty work, you don't mean dirty tricks, you mean hard work. Okay, you've
Sure.
covered a wide range. We have considerable time for questions and discussion, so let me turn to the audience. We have a couple of people with microphones, so first question right here, please identify yourself for Vladimir and the audience. Thank you.
Jay Thompson with Chevron. You were pretty clear in what you think Gazprom's prospects are for returning to 2008 levels of gas exports to Europe. To what extent does natural gas from shale or the advent of shale gas factor into that assessment?
Well, first I think it's already quite clear that the tight competition at the European spot market was a direct result of shale revolution in North America, because excessive LNG, where it went, largely to Europe. I don't think that shale gas production in Europe itself would would develop to that big scale as in the US. There is limited potential to that because of various reasons. But there is still a potential, particularly in countries like Poland, Ukraine. What is important is that shale gas in Europe can play a very important marginal role, because of the development of competitive market in Europe, and not just the spot trading, but better pipeline interconnections, storage capacity. All that contributes to the market infrastructure, becoming more and more suitable for much tighter competition. In this regard, the marginal but important role of shale gas matters, and I think Gazprom needs not to pretend that the shale development does not exist. You have heard big denials of the very problem by the Gazprom's top management at the same time when what they really needed to do was recognize its importance. They still continue to deny the importance of shale gas, but I think this is one of the issues which would continue to hit them right in the face, pretty much the same as recently development of spot market in Europe. So shale will be an important thing.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Farukh Nazarov from Central Asian Development Institute. You mentioned that the problem of losing elections were characterized by the absence of, in the regions basically, in Nizhny Tagil, Yaroslavl or elsewhere. I wonder, even if you can represent yourself well enough in those regions, how would you ensure that elections would be fair and basically avoid the issue of dubious elections? Because if you don't ensure that, even if you're well represented, it will go in vain. Thanks.
You can never be sure about that in the present Russian environment, that elections be free and fair. You don't get free and fair elections because you expect it to be free and fair and the authorities deliver. You go there and fight. Basically, through the recent series of regional campaigns, and particularly federal campaigns of December and March, we have developed great ability to defend our votes through sending many independent observers to polling stations, which are sorry, but they are often engaged in a very physical process of defending the votes, basically fighting. There is you can see a lot of videos on YouTube how independent voters are fighting, literally, physically, with members of elections commissions local who are engaged in fraud, that is a very tough and very physical process. There is absolutely no guarantee that we will be able to defend our votes, but we have to go and do it. That's the problem. And we have a lot of success stories, not just Yaroslavl. For instance, 4 years ago, also simultaneously with the presidential elections, when Dmitry Medvedev was elected, we had municipal elections in Moscow. And that was a humiliating defeat for the opposition. Basically, most of the candidates didn't pass through. This time around, Democratic Choice Movement had a joint list of candidates with the Yabloko party on the municipal elections. About 50 of our candidates made it through to the municipal councils. They are deputies now. For instance, one of our members of the Democratic Choice, Sergei Trifonov, ran in Dragomilov, in western part of Moscow, where Putin voted. He got more votes than Putin on his polling station. Putin, his result reached near 40%, and Putin's result at this particular polling station was lower than that. So, I mean, you know, we have certain techniques of how to confront that challenge. It's not going to be an easy thing. Please don't think that way. But we are prepared to take that challenge and prepared to fight for that.
Ed Chow, CSIS. Vladimir, that's all right. Just to follow up on the previous question on gas, and then I have a second question on oil. Could you tell us a little bit about what your outlook is for the independent gas producing sector? Is Novotek a one-off, having to do with some personal relationships, or is this something that may lead to a broader phenomenon that breaks Gazprom's monopoly on gas? The second question on oil, as far as I can tell, Vladimir Putin from 1999 to 2008 has to be the luckiest oil man ever in terms of the trajectory of prices in the global marketplace. That's, even though oil prices are very high today, it's unlikely to duplicate what happened in terms of growth of oil prices at the previous times when he was president. To what extent has the lesson of the 2008-2009 oil price collapse sunk in to the current Russian leadership, or do they think that that's just an anomaly? We're back with $100 oil.
Thank you. First, with the Novotek and independent gas producer question, Ed, I've noticed that you are trying to soften the sharp angles. Look, there's no such thing as Novotek, the independent gas producers, anymore. It is bought by Timchenko, and when it was not controlled by Timchenko, Gazprom did its best to basically prevent Novotek's development, access to gas pipeline system, and actually Gazprom tried to contain Novotek's expansion. Things have dramatically changed since Mr. Timchenko bought Novotek over, and Gazprom has started to give away generously many important perspectives for Novotek. It's quite clear that it became the second beloved child of Putin in the gas industry, with massive tax exemptions and subsidies promised to Novotek with Yamal LNG project and so on. So I think, look, it is completely useless now to talk about the independent gas producers sector in the sense that we did several years ago before Timchenko came. Right then we had a clear split. We had Gazprom and we had independent private companies which were trying to somehow perform in this very difficult monopoly environment. Now you have just another smaller satellite which is basically part of the same umbrella. So I think we need to reconsider the whole notion of independent gas producers anymore. There's no such thing. Since Timchenko took Novotek over, and we just have the oil companies who are independent from Gazprom and have their interests. But I don't think it's useless to talk about the independent producers sector as we did. And regarding the oil price, what is important is why the oil price cannot help Putin now, even despite the fact that it is high and it might grow further. It is because the enormous growth of the size of the government in the recent years. And for instance, by the way, India strongly advised that you ask this question to Alexei Kudrin. In 2003, the non-interest expenses of federal budget were just 13% of GDP. Last year, they were over 21% of GDP. And it was all, basically this growth have happened under Kudrin. I want to hear his reply to that. He is perceived as the tough monetarist guy, you know, the fiscal discipline hawk and stuff like that. I would like somebody to ask him this question. It would be very
maybe imagine the counterfactual if he weren't there.
Yeah, very, very interesting to hear his answer. But that was a reflection of that was a price we paid for Putin's model, enormously increasing size of the government. And that was not related to social spending. Social spending was just a fraction of budget expenses, and for instance, this was largely what is called spending on the chapter called national economy, subsidies to enterprises and federal investments. In 2005, the spending on national economy was less than 8% of all the spending the federal budget. Now it's 20. It's almost 2 trillion rubles. Government directly interfering with its spending in the economic affairs. This is why we have to impose higher taxes on the medium and small-sized businesses. You can see how this model works. Oil prices will not going to be enough for this dragon because it requires more and more sacrifices. And you have seen with recent placement of Russian bonds, basically what happens, particularly after Kudrin's departure and appointment of a much weaker finance minister, Siluanov, it looks like Russia is reconsidering its low debt policy. One advantage we had in the recent period is a very low level of government debt. So basically there were always people whispering on Putin's ear saying, we need not to worry about the budget and fiscal situation. We can always borrow more. And I remember, again, there are a lot of comparisons, worthwhile comparisons between the present situation and what happened 20 years ago. It was exactly the case after the oil price collapse of 1985. Exactly the same words were whispered on the ear of Gorbachev. You remember where that situation went. So I think we're quite far from being there yet. But it's quite clear that the size of the government is so high that the extremely high oil prices are neither helping to keep capital coming in, nor to maintain the surplus of the federal budget as it was 12 years ago under Kasyanov's government. So it's a totally different historical chapter.
And if you don't remember what happened in the late 1980s, read Yegor Gaidar's Collapse of Empire.
Yeah.
Quite a detailed tale. Yes, right here. You've been waiting patiently.
Thank you. Jenya Ustinova, Eurasia Group. I have 2 questions, one on economics, one on politics. On the economics front, can you please talk about some of the reforms under the new government that might be unveiled that you would consider positive, that would correct the economic course, or rather the trajectory? And on the second front, could you discuss a little bit the new political party registration law and whether that would actually be an obstacle to formation of viable opposition parties, because it permits so many, the requirements are very lax. Thank you.
Thank you. So far as the economic reforms is concerned, how much time do we have? You cannot limit that. There was so much done wrong in the past 12 years, almost everything. So you cannot limit that to 2 or 3. But I would say, if speaking about my political priorities, what do we do if we come to power? We need to completely reconsider the very role of the government in the economy. We need a massive sell-off of government property, massive exit of government from unnecessary regulatory functions, which was the idea of the Gref economic reform program 12 years ago, but it basically was never implemented. It ended just with adoption of very pretty concepts, which have largely been left on paper. We need significant lowering of tax burden. we need an exit of government from the so-called strategic sectors. We need to encourage private investment as opposed to relying on government financing of investment projects. So basically, big exit of the government from the economic policy, from economic situation, from the markets. That's one of the priorities which we should be following. And the government, of course, that also has direct relevance to the fiscal situation as well. Government should completely reconsider its attitude towards its performance of its important functions like social functions or security functions. We need to put that house in order. We need to carry out a successful pension reform. If you'd like, I can elaborate on that more. Because multiple different attempts of absolutely different concepts of pension reform was one of the complete failures of Vladimir Putin over his 12 years of rule. We have an idea how to do that. And Mikhail Dmitriev was here. He is the guy who basically was one of the author of the concept that we propose. We want to create something not directly similar to Norwegian system, but what we want to do is we want to make sure that certain assets which government still controls basically work for Russian pensioners, and the income which the state deprives through taxes on oil and gas exports basically goes to the capital of pension fund. This is what we need to make sure to do. I'll be happy to talk more about that. We need to carry out very substantial army reform, because we need a well-equipped, modern army capable of defending our national interests. But right now we have a very inefficient army, which is at the same time too costly. For instance, you heard a debate about a procurement of military hardware recently, a very hard fight inside the government, including Putin, Medvedev, Rogozin, and others. The problem here is that pretty much similarly, because of over-centralized and monopoly environment, what you get is immediately when you increase spending on purchases of military hardware, the monopolist enterprises just increase prices and you pay bigger paycheck and get less supplies. And that was the trap which Putin fell into all over his 12 years of rule. This is the price that he paid for his love towards centralization, verticals, and all that unnecessary stuff. Army have suffered from that big time, because one thing which we could have done and should have done by all means during the recent 12 years is we should have used this very favorable period for building up a modern and capable army. We didn't do that. Putin failed to do that. That's his personal responsibility. This is what we're going to correct. So putting the government's house in order, that's another very important priority which we would demand from whatever new government appears. At some moment, this will be our government, so we will be responsible for this section. And as far as politics is concerned, your question was about the party law, right? Well, again, sorry, but that is important. I'm continuously referring to the experience of the period of 20 years ago, late 80s. We had a lot of people, primarily Soviet dissidents, Bukovsky, Novodvorskaya, and Народно-Трудовой Союз, which was the key dissident organization that fought Soviet regime. They were saying now what the so-called elections which the Communist Party and KGB are organizing, it's a trick. It's all false. We should not participate because they want to trick us. We're going to wait until free and fair elections occur, and only then we will take part. These guys have kept waiting forever. Other people came who participated in these absolutely crooked, tricky procedures and won and changed the country. This is basically what we aim to do at the present. We see this new party law as an attempt by the government to let off steam and still maintain control. But we won't let them do it because there are clear opportunities with this party law. The most important advantage there is that to be able to participate in regional and municipal elections, you have to have an official license. Now, with the new party law, we can get it at much lower cost, because I was involved in the setup of Parnas opposition party last year under the old law. It was extremely expensive. You had to spend about $1 million just for a right to knock on the door of the Ministry of Justice and ask whether they let us in or not, with 99% certainty that they will not. Now all this burden is lifted, so it's much easier for us to try. We will keep trying. This is our approach. And many people, just predicting the clarifications for this question, many people are being afraid that there will be too many parties emerging now because of the very low requirement for membership. Don't worry about that. That will not be a problem. The problem is absence of new political parties participating on the scene and absence of competition. As far as government's clear desire to create a multi-party chaos to discredit the whole system, which is a hidden intent of what they do with lowering the requirement to 500, and at the same time not allowing election blocks to be formed, which is clearly an indication of a tricky approach. The problem is that this trick might work if this new system is introduced before large-scale federal elections. We don't have that in the medium term. What we have is a sequence of very low-profile regional and municipal campaigns. Only big parties with real strong organizational structure reaching out to many regions will be capable of doing that. I can tell you my opinion. You will be able to count new parties with strong representation in multiple regions with fingers of your single hand. There will be not, on paper, 100, 200 parties might emerge. Real parties who will be able to perform campaigns in the regions will be 3, 4, 5 maximum. We will be one of those. And basically, I think there will be, it's just one of the propaganda notions. A lot of noise will be raised that 100 parties is a bad thing just to discredit this whole process. Don't buy this argument. Competition is always good for a consumer, which means voter. It's much better to have a supermarket with a big choice of food, many positions, right? Than a Soviet store when you have only Narzan mineral water and nothing to eat. That's the situation with the party law. We clearly view it as an opportunity rather than a risk.
Well, with Narzan, you'd at least have good mineral water. At the risk of being accused of being a rightist, let me turn to the left side of the room. Okay. I'm going to come back to the center. Yes.
My name is Azamat. I'm a Rumsfeld Fellow from Kyrgyzstan. So there was a recent meeting of Eurasia or Eurasian Economic Entity, and so it made clear that Putin is really motivated to continue its work towards integration of former Soviet Union countries from the standpoint of economic, and there is activization of trade union, customs union, sorry. There is certain pressure to attract more countries into it. What's your take on it? Do you perceive it as a political or economic union, and would it be beneficial for Russia?
Thank you. That's a very important issue. And if, again, similarly to Milov-Nemtsov approach taken in the Putin results paper, I strongly advise you to check. Putin, of course, is very concerned about Russia's presence in Central Asia, but you got to check the real facts about what have been happening there in the past decade. If you analyze the facts, you could clearly see that Russia's positions, economic, political, have not very much advanced, particularly compared to the Chinese positions. Basically, to summarize this whole issue, we are losing strategic competition for influence in Central Asia to China big time. That's the result of Putin's Eurasian policy. Now, as far as his it's the actual result, not just to talk about what's Russia's goal in Central Asia. Now, speaking about Putin's view of the situation, he's clearly preoccupied with the idea of restoring the Soviet Union. He's barely hiding that. He spoke about the collapse of the Soviet Union as the biggest tragedy, and it's quite clear that he personally aims to restore it. He sees it as his political, historic mission. Now, what I have to say, it's important that during his election campaigns, before Duma elections and presidential elections, he had written 2 big articles, particularly about that. Eurasian integration is a cornerstone of his geopolitical vision and strategy. Again, I strongly advise to check that with on-the-ground reality as perceived by Russian voters. One of the main ideas which Putin is strongly defending openly, even during the pre-election periods, is that to be able to maintain this whole Eurasian Union thing and Russia's influence in these countries, we need to keep the borders with them open. I have to tell you that, first, about 80% of the Russian population strongly supports introduction of entry visas with Central Asian countries. And second, that is a very touchy political subject in Russia. Probably one of the most heated subjects in the whole political discussion of the moment. Basically what I'm saying, the conclusion is that Russian population has a slightly different view on Eurasian integration than Vladimir Putin does. Fundamentally different view, I have to say. And basically this is one of the issues which we, opposition, are aimed to using in our campaigns.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Dylan Miles Primakov from Georgetown University. My question is actually about U.S. policy toward Russia. It seems to me that the next big debate in that area is going to be over the plan of repealing the Jackson-Vanik Law and replacing it with the Magnitsky Act. I wanted to ask, from your perspective, do you think the U.S. government implementing the Magnitsky Act would, on balance, be a good thing or a bad thing for your political goals?
That's a very difficult question. First, about the U.S. policy towards Russia, I have to be honest with you. I have many field experience of dealing with Russian voters, and I have certain opinion about what people in my country want and what they do not. Generally, sad as it might sound, but that's the reality. Most of the people do not perceive United States actions on the international arena very positively, because they have seen the television picture of that kind of policy in a recent decade or so, and they have got, certain perception of what the U.S. policy is about. I wouldn't elaborate further, but it's it's an extremely difficult subject. When you talk to Russian voters about America, a lot of them hardly are ready to perceive America as a friend. And that is not necessarily a result of Putin's propaganda. And I want you to understand that any kind of action that the United States takes towards Russia is viewed by average Russians, which is our key concern at the moment, because we are about to deal with them and win their support to get to power. Ordinary Russians view any kind of US action motivated by probably best intentions, through the prism of the picture which they saw on television in the past 10, 12, 15 years. That is very important to understand. Now, with regard to Jackson-Vanik and Magnitsky Law, I have been speaking about that, particularly at the US-Russia Business Council this morning. We had a very tough exchange of opinions about that. I strongly support the cause of Magnitsky Law, and I'm very much outraged with what Russian authorities have done to Sergei Magnitsky, and I want these people to be brought to justice. One important thing I want to say is that to bring somebody to justice you need to use legal mechanisms which are normally set for that kind of purpose. And, you know, we have the judiciary system and standards of how it works. To announce somebody guilty takes a special procedure, institution, and so on. Let me not tell you this thing. This is quite clear. I think that voluntary judgment, politically charged judgment, might not necessarily be productive, particularly if you have a lot of very charged Russian oppositioners running around with their own version of lists of who should be persecuted, and their reading of why these people should be persecuted. And they meet a lot of good reception, particularly here in Washington. That's a dangerous kind of situation. I'm a bit afraid that it might go too far at some point, particularly with certain asymmetric measures taken on the Russian side. And now, as far as Jackson Vanik is concerned, my consistent position over the years have been that it should be repealed without preconditions. Because Jackson Vanik, I read my fellow opposition colleagues Boris Nemtsov and Garry Kasparov had recently written an article in the Wall Street Journal with the title, very appealing to Russian voters potentially, "The Right Way to Sanction Russia." I don't think that they will get much support if they will distribute articles titled like that in my country. But basically what they argue is that a repeal of Jackson Vanik will be a victory for Putin. That is flat wrong. Jackson Vanik in its present shape is extremely advantageous to Putin because it does no direct harm to him. Putin is not a particular enthusiast of Russia joining WTO. He was, you know, flip-flopping on the very idea of whether we need or need not. The situation where raw materials exports controlled by his personal friends are thriving, and on the other hand, development of high-tech businesses is contained because of trade restrictions on the international markets, that is a very advantageous situation for Putin. And another advantageous situation for him is the fact that he can use this issue in domestic propaganda. He can say, oh, well, here's the proof that the United States unjustifiably discriminates Russia. Jackson Vanik, come on, you know, all the Jews who wanted to immigrate to Israel already did so and they're still discriminating us. That you hear that every day. And people in Russia buy it because the amendment is still in place. Very unfortunate. It needs to be repealed.
Yes, I see a hand here on the left. Young lady, yes.
Hi, Olga Belaglova from National Journal. I was wondering if I could ask about U.S. Natural gas exports and how that plays into Russia's economy, and you know how that will change the market, and whether exporting the, you know, you talked about U.S. and Russia relations with other countries on energy, so perhaps the export of the fracking process and how that might play into U.S.-Russia relations.
Well, first I have to say that we already discussed that before, that the developments in the U.S. Gas industry and gas market had dramatically influenced international markets because first it became clear that closing down of North American market for net imports had produced an extreme supply pressure and oversupply factor on the core traditional Gazprom's market, which is Europe. It also basically brought down the idea of Gazprom's potential aspirations to develop exports of Russian LNG to the American market, which basically is we have no chance for that anymore. Now, as far as the fracking technology is concerned, as far as the shale gas production is concerned, I'd say that it's very important to understand that export of this technology would further predetermine the development of competition on the gas market in Europe with development of European shale gas reserves. I don't think that Gazprom is pretty much ready to seriously discuss this implementation of these technologies on the Russian soil, primarily because of we are so over-equipped with conventional gas reserves that we don't need to talk about it. So I'd say it's clearly a game changer, and I'd say that Gazprom had still hard time in coming to terms with this new reality on the international gas markets. I just hope that they reconsider their approach the sooner the better, and become much more suitable for increasing competition on the gas markets.
Yes.
Goldwyn, Global Strategies. Are the oligarchs playing any role in the development of new political parties or in the protest movement, even as far as overtly or covertly?
The oligarchs issues is a very difficult issue at the moment because we have experienced the change of the very nature of the Russian oligarchy, people, large businessmen who are extremely close to decision-making in power and so on. For instance, we have seen the emergence of totally new class of oligarchs who were previously close friends of Vladimir Putin and became billionaires during years of his rule, like Yuri Kovalchuk, Gennady Timchenko, or Arkady Rotenberg. Of course, they are not involved in politics at all. There is basically a big question about whether they are true owners of the businesses attributed to them. Because these people keep surprisingly low profile for high-ranked billionaires. And there is a tradition in the Russian system where you have a lot of businessmen around certain high-ranked official who nominally own the businesses that are being developed because of the administrative support received from that official. And these people are considered nominal owners, but frequently it is later discovered that they are in fact not. For instance, I will remind you the story of Shalva Chigirinsky, the businessman who was prosperous at the time when Yuri Lushkov was the mayor of Moscow. Chigirinsky was the owner of Moscow refinery, he controlled major development projects and so on. Later on, before Lushkov was sacked, Chigirinsky had split with Lushkov family, and they had their case and their dispute considered in the London court, where Chigirinsky had testified that in fact he was not the true owner of property attributed to him. More than 50% were controlled by Lushkov family through Yelena Baturin, Lushkov's wife. I'd say that surprising low profile of these so-called oligarchs, which nominally own big property and emerged as big businessmen under Putin, suggests an idea that this scheme is very popular among Russian officials when they do not nominally own something, but they have a friend who does. But he's not necessarily the end beneficiary. We have had a litigation with Timchenko, and following our book, Putin, the Results, where he was mentioned. And we have a certain amount of knowledge about this gentleman and what he is up to. I have serious doubts that this new oligarchy, which emerged under Putin, are the true owners of their business. I think I'm being quite straightforward in what I have to say. Now, as far as the old oligarchs are concerned, they still cannot shake off the fundamental scare which had emerged after the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. They pretty much learned a lesson. For instance, as far as the financing of the opposition forces is concerned, we are getting much bigger support, direct financial support from not truly rich owners of small businesses, but many of them. Then we get financial support from big oligarchs on the Forbes list. In fact, we get none. people who are donating to us are owners of medium and small size businesses. And big oligarchs prefer to stay away because they are so afraid that somebody will take away their property.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Milov. My name is Jeannie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Would you share with us your vision of your own party about the Russian and China's relationship now, and if once your party is in position, and also the situation of gas and oil regarding to energy and the development of Russia between Iran, Afghanistan, and the South China Sea. Thank you. And also one more, the Arctic. Thank you.
That is a very complicated matter. There has been very intensive relations going on between Vladimir Putin's government and the Chinese government. A lot of contracts signed, a lot of deals, and so on. A lot of Russian public is extremely concerned about the non-transparent nature of a lot of these relations. Particularly, for instance, I have to say that the border demarcation agreement of 2004, from which China benefited, was negatively perceived by a lot of Russian public. And people ask us these questions, and we have to respond. Also, there is a big strategic long-term oil supply contract, the conditions of which are also extremely non-transparent, and there are constant rumors in the media that China received huge discounts for oil supplies under that contract compared to normal market oil prices. There is also great demand from the general public for disclosure of the conditions of this contract, and Vladimir Putin is being questioned very hard whether he violated Russian strategic national interests while concluding that contract. There is also more room for suspicion because, for instance, we have negotiations of potential natural gas supply to China, where the Chinese government has taken a very tough position on price. And the currently discussed idea of price of gas supply is far below anything Gazprom can get from its other markets, be it European, Far Eastern, and so, which also, to some observers, it suggests that there might be a reason for a suspicion that the price under the already signed and implemented oil supply contract might also involve huge discounts, same as currently demanded for gas. Basically, I have to say that there are a lot of issues in the Russian-Chinese relations which lack the necessary transparency that might reassure the Russian society that all what was done in Russia-Chinese relations was done following the aspirations of Russia's strategic national interest. You're asking about the position of my party. We are openly asking these questions to Vladimir Putin because, he's constantly accusing us of literally being American spies and working for State Department, CIA, whomever. This is being openly said on television, in public, and so on. Now, what we want to do is we want to revert that question. Our position in terms of as far as Putin's relations with China are concerned is to demand accountability on whether, when Putin is engaged in relations with China, whether he thoroughly pursues Russia's national interest or not. We want to question that. It's still an open question. There is no answer being delivered.
He could be a Chinese spy. Yes.
No, we're not going as far as that, but there are clear unanswered questions.
There's a second part of the question.
Yes, about Iran, Afghanistan, and so on. We see the current turbulence in the Muslim world as a strategic threat to Russia's national interests. We have had problems with expansion of certain aggressive behavior from these territories before. For instance, I remember what panic was there in Moscow in '96 when the Taliban had advanced and taken Kabul. They have had emergency meetings because it was widely perceived that they would go further to Central Asia. It was happening not that long ago. And we also have Iran, which had developed the ballistic missile capability that allows Iranian missiles to reach Moscow. And this country is about to develop nuclear weapons, which is quite clear. That is a strategic threat, and Russia has to have answer to it. And also I have to say that the strategic threat from certain Islamic countries is recognized by the general population. Russians in general view it as a threat. So I think in this regard, our position strongly meets the aspirations of the Russian public. We want answers to that sort of questions. We are ready to deliver our ideas what to do in this case, but we believe that Putin's government is not doing enough to contain these strategic threats, to help the NATO mission in Afghanistan, to contain the Iranian nuclear threat, and so on. I think the government of Russia should do more to address all these challenges.
Yes, right here. Hi, I'm Jason Jia with the Public Affairs Council in Washington, D.C., and also the president of the Alpha Bank Fellowship Alumni Association. As an opposition leader, I know that your core audience is the Russian people, the Russian voters. And you'd expressed earlier your confidence in new parties in Russia being able to not only achieve power, but being able to competently administrate and govern, which is a very important message for international audiences as well. But I think secretly in Washington, perhaps Europe, there's a sense that as much as we like to slam Putin the regime on human rights and other issues, he's a devil we know. And I was just curious if you have a certain reaction to that sort of sentiment that's out there.
Sorry, I didn't get the sentiment despite...
despite as much as Putin the regime is criticized, he's the devil we know. He's a known quantity, whereas other leaders that come to power are not necessarily a known quantity.
I understand. Thank you very much for the question. That is, over the past 20 years, I observed many great inertias on the Western part. The West was not able to assess the high dynamics of the Russian situation at critical moments. I remember President George Bush the Senior speaking in Kiev in July '91, just several weeks before GKChP, the August '91 coup d'etat, saying that he supported the idea of keeping Soviet Union in place. And I also remember how the Western leaders hesitated to follow with their reaction of the August '91 coup d'etat, and some of them, like President Mitterrand, even had prepared to recognize the temporary committee as the legitimate Soviet government. I also remember how during the '90s a lot of people in the West had embraced Yeltsin's government with a lack of due realism and criticism of looking at it. And I remember the great awakening of late '90s and early 2000s when there were a lot of the flood of articles came that, oh, we were wrong because there was a lot of corruption taking place and a lot of other bad things, and we needed not to support Yeltsin outright the way we did. Pretty much a similar syndrome exists with Putin. This is why when I speak about the need to work with Russian voters as a priority, change in Russia will be homegrown. We understand the situation on the ground better. we are ready and happy to share that knowledge with you, but we are the ones who will be delivering that change to the Russian political system. My advice to the Western observers is that don't fall into that trap again. Don't fall into the inertia trap. Don't focus on the old reality, which is, as recent months have shown, is quickly fading away. You've got to prepare for a big change, which not necessarily will look as a lot of sometimes brilliant Western analysts predict. Take a look at the Arab world, for instance. One important thing to understand is eventually Russia will become a normal democratic country. But not necessarily it will be the type of liberal Western democracy as a lot of Western observers got used to. It will be a more difficult, complicated people's democracy, not necessarily Westernized, not necessarily too liberal. Take a look at the Arab countries or Turkey, where you have examples of that. So this is why, again, I strongly encourage you to think in an unorthodox manner. Think a bit beyond the status quo and the present reality that you've got used to.
Vladimir, I think with that piece of advice, that is an excellent point to conclude on. We have unduly exploited you for the past couple of days. On behalf of CSIS and everyone here in the audience, let me thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today, and also express best wishes for success in your political efforts upon returning to Moscow, and more importantly, when you leave Moscow and go out into the regions and engage in the local and municipal regional political elections that will be coming up in the months and years ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you.